Hi everyone, Aaron Maté joins us today, a journalist, author, and political commentator with The Gray Zone, and to discuss, I guess, the holes which are being punched in the Ukraine narrative. It's good to see you, Aaron.
You too, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Across the NATO countries now, there's a certain panic in the air as we lost the war in Ukraine, but it also some of the panic appears to stem from the also that the narrative that we have been told over the past 3 years has also been proven to be full of holes, and to a large extent, this has also been a war of narratives over the past few years. And I think one of the latest holes in the narrative was with this New York Times article, which came out recently, outlining the extent to which the United States had been leading the war in out of Germany. What do you make of this article, though? Or how significant is it?
Well, the article just fleshed out what you and I have been saying for a long time, which is that the US was behind this war and was using Ukraine to bleed Russia to the point where US military leaders were literally planning Ukrainian military operations and directing their strikes from a military base in Germany. Uh, and there's just some funny details about it. So, for example, we learned that because the US didn't want to admit publicly that it was selecting targets for Ukraine to hit, they just changed the name targets to points of interest. So technically, they could get away with lying to the public and saying, we're not taking part in targeting Russia because in their planning, they didn't call the targets targets. They called them points of interest. That's the kind of semantic deception that had to be undertaken in order to wage a proxy war from Germany against Russia. And we learned that even after US officials assessed that the risk of Russia using a nuclear weapon had dramatically increased, they still kept going. They didn't change their strategy really at all. Um, and they authorized weapon systems, escalating weapon systems, despite not being sure how Russia would respond, including not being sure that Russia wouldn't hit NATO troops. So essentially, they were the ones moving their own red lines. Contrary to what we constantly heard about Putin, has all these red lines and it's okay to cross them. No, it was actually our red lines that kept moving. And they did so relying on actually Putin and Russia to be restrained. So there's another aspect of the rhetoric of the public rhetoric being undermined because the whole time we kept hearing Putin's a madman. If we don't stop him here, he's going to go on to the rest of Europe and maybe the rest of the world. Actually, the whole time they were relying on Putin to be restrained as the U.S. and they're continuously surpassed their own red lines. And then, of course, there's a lot of narrative management here to basically blame the Ukrainians for any failures. So every time there's a failure in the article, it's always the Ukrainians' fault because they didn't follow the U.S. advice. They didn't stick to the plan. There's no responsibility whatsoever. The only hint at responsibility comes from the fact that they acknowledge, as was publicly known, that General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top U.S. military leader, said that Ukraine could not win the war because Russia was just too big. And they ignored that advice. And they ignored Mark Milley when he called for diplomacy back in October 2022. That's the only sort of gesture toward acknowledging that there was some dissension inside the U.S. ranks and there was some awareness that Ukraine couldn't win. Otherwise, the article says basically, to whatever extent Ukraine lost, it's their fault, not ours.
Yeah, well, there were some articles coming out earlier. I think about 2 years ago, you had the Washington Post also writing about the summer offensive of 2023. Well, no, that was a year and a half ago, anyways. And the main argument there was also that the Ukrainians were too risk averse, I think was the word they
That's right.
used, and
Yeah.
they didn't. And a lot of them, the military leadership, were opposing it while they were pressured by the United States. Kind of begs the question, though, when does this cross from being a proxy war to a direct war when, especially with some of these weapon systems, if the United States is directly involved? We haven't really had a serious discussion about this, I think.
Yeah, Alexander Mercouris makes the point that he doesn't use the term proxy war anymore. He calls this a coalition war just because of the extent of the involvement of the NATO coalition, particularly the US. And yeah, literally, if you have the US choosing targets overseeing the firing, giving Ukraine the coordinates. Literally, I mean, that's the impression of my article is that basically Ukraine did not use these long range weapons, these weapon systems, without U.S. approval and without U.S. coordinates. So in that case, the distinction between Ukraine and the U.S. is really meaningless. It's the U.S. directly targeting Russian forces. It's just Ukraine that might be pushing an actual button or manning the system, but otherwise, it's all the U.S. So yeah, maybe even the term proxy war is inadequate at this point. Maybe direct war, coalition war
Yeah, well,
is is more appropriate.
yeah, because if you plan the war, you select the targets, you supply the weapons, and on top of it, with a lot of these long-range weapons, they actually have to be managed by American soldiers as well. There's suddenly no role at all for the Ukrainians. This is starting to seem more and more like a direct war. But there's also, yeah, a recent issue was that with Boris Johnson, because when in which he argued, yeah, a few weeks ago that yeah, the nationalists didn't permit Zelensky to essentially implement his peace mandate because he was elected in 2019 on a peace mandate, winning 73% of the votes to implement the Minsk agreement, make peace with Donbass, or at least open dialogue and make peace with the Russians. And yeah, I made the argument as well that, well, since 2019, that he was pressured to reverse, well, the democratic mandate he had to make peace. But I was told that the nationalist narrative was Russian propaganda.
Of course,
We
yeah, of
shouldn't
course.
repeat this, but is this what is the significance here? Do you see or does it actually have any impact? Do you see the narrative shifting, or do we just continue with the same storylines in the media?
Well, in terms of the impact on the narrative, no, it doesn't, because we just have such an obedient media system in which some facts can't be acknowledged. So even Boris Johnson acknowledging, as you said, that it was the Ukrainian ultranationalists, the extremists, who stood in the way of implementing the Minsk Accords, that doesn't matter. It just doesn't register. I mean, we pointed this. I mean, we shared the clip of Boris Johnson. It goes out to our circles, our niche circles, but otherwise, it just doesn't land because it's inconvenient to the narrative. But what's funny about Boris Johnson admitting that is that he's Zelensky's biggest foreign cheerleader. He's really sung Zelensky's praises because Zelensky's essentially followed his orders. But what was Boris Johnson doing in saying that? It was the ultranationalists who sabotaged Zelensky's peace mandate. He was undercutting the main argument that Zelensky made in the Oval Office to JD Vance when he told JD Vance, what kind of diplomacy are you talking about? After JD Vance advocated diplomacy. And what Zelensky said to JD Vance was, listen, I tried to make a deal with Putin. And he invoked the agreement that Zelensky signed with Putin in Paris in December 2019, in which there were supposed to be prisoner exchanges and there were supposed to be steps towards implementing the Minsk Accords. And Zelensky said Putin didn't follow any of it. So basically, Zelensky was trying to say that Putin had sabotaged their agreement that they signed together back in December 2019. And therefore, I can't make an agreement with him. Well, Boris Johnson comes out and says a few weeks later, yeah, actually, it was the ultra-nationalists inside Ukraine that prevented Zelensky from implementing the compromise because they opposed the compromise. And what was the compromise? It was respecting the Minsk Accords, respecting autonomy for ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine, which they refuse to do because they don't see these ethnic Russians as equal Ukrainians, and they don't even want them in their country. So Boris Johnson made that admission at a very, very inconvenient time for Zelensky.
Have you come across any more information though, about the role of the nationalists? Because before the Russians invaded, I remember in the media, even from CNN to The Guardian, it was quite common to write about yeah, the danger of the rise of I guess the fascist elements within Ukraine and how much power they acquired. But suddenly, after 2022, they all became former fascists. They were,
Yeah.
reformed a little bit, like Giuliani in Syria. So it was, yeah, it was interesting how that switched and became again Russian propaganda overnight. But did you see any changes here, or is it still, yeah, holding on to the key narrative?
Uh, I saw there was one article in the Financial Times last year called "Ukraine Faces Its Darkest Hour," and it was that contained a rare acknowledgement of the role of the ultranationalists. Let me quote some of it for you. This is from September of 2024. And they say this: Zelensky's biggest problem might come from a nationalist minority opposed to any compromise, some of whom are now armed and trained to fight. And it quotes one Ukrainian official saying that any negotiation with Russia could be a trigger for social instability. Zelensky knows this very well. And finally, it quotes the chair of the Ukrainian parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, who says this: there will always be a radical segment of Ukrainian society that will call any negotiation capitulation. The far right in Ukraine is growing. The right wing is a danger to democracy. So that's a rare acknowledgement in establishment media, the Financial Times, about the threat that Zelensky faces and that Ukraine faces from within. But otherwise, no. That was an exception to the rule, just basically pretending that this ultranationalist minority that has stood in the way of peace for a long time, with the backing of the US, we have to stress, because every time the far right has opposed the Minsk Accords and then opposed further accommodation, they've had essentially the backing, if not publicly, the tacit backing of the U.S. This is a dynamic going back a long time. So that's one exception. But otherwise, no, I don't see this being acknowledged at all. And it's a problem because I don't know what's in Zelensky's head anymore. He's hard to figure out. It seems like he's ultimately totally sided with the far right, and I don't really see him taking any steps to try to distance himself from them. But you have to wonder if the U.S. changed its position, actually, if there was a concrete change to U.S. position, and they said to Zelensky, we'll back you up if you make peace with Russia, would that then empower him to make a peace deal? Or has he just gone so far into his position of abandoning peace, walking away from the Minsk Accords, that a change in position won't even matter anymore? And you can see that, like, even with Trump saying we have to make peace and Steve Witkoff making positive overtures toward that regard, Zelensky still does not seem on board. So it seems to me like, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that Zelensky is now in lockstep with the far right, contrary to the early years of his presidency.
Yeah, well, both Poroshenko and Zelensky initially took a very anti-nationalist stance. Again, they were calling for, respecting the rights of ethnic Russians. But I think, yeah, as you said, the fascist groups, they functioned, I guess, more or less like a veto power. And I think this is why they were also backed by the US to begin with. They had an ability to put a check on any sentiments in society which pursued any reconciliation. And I think this is also what applied to, yeah, back in 2019 when Zelensky won. Again, this was going to be a huge shift. He was going to, yeah, end the war, pursue a peaceful path. And then, of course, you had these fascist groups coming along, and the slogan which they were using as they were marching, the nationalists marching in Kiev was, this is no capitulation. And I saw this being, so this one term, it was being repeated also in the Western media that if, implementing effectively what the Ukrainians had voted for, that this was a form of capitulation and we should, stand up for the Ukrainians so they didn't have to capitulate. So in other words, they didn't have to implement the actual peace mandate, which the overwhelming majority of people voted for. So it's quite disturbing, and yeah, how it suddenly dismissed democracy as well, it's capitulation, and
Yeah,
but
100%. And who backed him up in that? It was the top U.S. envoy to Ukraine, and William Taylor. Uh, last year or the year before, he told the Washington Post that at the same time as these far right extremists were saying no to capitulation and marching against Zelensky, that Taylor met with Zelensky, and Zelensky was trying to figure out a way to impose the Steinmeier formula, which is the formula from the former German foreign minister about how to implement the Minsk Accords. And William Taylor says in his own telling that he told Zelensky, Steinmeier doesn't know what he's talking about. It's a terrible idea. So what was William Taylor saying? Listen to the far right. No to capitulation. The Minsk Accords, it's a terrible idea. So caught between people carrying torches in the street, threatening to kill him, saying no to capitulation, and then his top U.S. ally saying, forget the Minsk Accords. Zelensky had no room to actually take any steps. And certainly he's dug himself a very big hole now by even signing a presidential decree ruling out talks with Russia so long as Vladimir Putin is in power.
Well, besides the nationalists, it looked like the United States had a very good grip on the intelligence services in Ukraine as well. And for me, this was a very interesting achievement because uh, up until 2014, the Ukrainian intelligence services, they had worked very closely with Russia. They, much like the majority of the Ukrainian population back then, they saw Russia as being their main partner. And then, yeah, that was another article which came out in New York Times, but that was in February of 2024 when it outlined this. Yeah, what happened in the days after the toppling of Yanukovych, and it said pretty much on the first on the first or second day after the coup, you had a new intelligence chief, which I guess had been yeah, approved by the United States, and the first thing he did was to call the CIA and MI6 to
Yeah.
begin essentially a secret war against the Russians, and then you have complementary articles in Washington Post confirming that also the Americans had to build up the intelligence services from scratch because they couldn't use the old ones. Well, so it does sound like they captured the whole state there though.
Yes, there was the one in the Washington Post quoted a former CIA officer who said that Ukraine's military intelligence wing became, quote, our little baby. That's how he described our little baby after the 2014 coup. So imagine Russia's perspective. You have US officials now bragging that Ukraine's military intelligence division was our little baby to the point where the US built a new headquarters for our little baby. You had the New York Times saying that the US built up about 10 secret bases inside of Ukraine. Recently, there was an article in the New Yorker where they describe how when our little baby and other Ukrainian intelligence services carried out assassinations of Russian officers or of rebel leaders in the Donbass, the U.S. was involved to the point where one Donbass leader, rebel leader, was killed in an elevator, and afterwards, the New Yorker reports the CIA handed out little patches on saying on them elevator. Okay, so this is not just after Russia invades. This is before Russia invades. The U.S. was so involved in using Ukraine as a proxy on Russia's border that it built up bases, built up headquarters for its new baby, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, and was involved in assassinations. And people want to still call all this, Russia's invasion unprovoked, when even the same outlets that call the invasion unprovoked now all report that the U.S. was provoking Russia by using Ukraine as a proxy in the 10 years before Russia's invasion. It really is. It's it's just very striking. But luckily, for whatever reason, people feel compelled to now come out with some acknowledgement of what happened, and so we have all this rich detail from the horse's mouth, and we also have. I wrote an article last year when I interviewed Andrei Tillichenko, he was part of the Maidan movement and part of the post-Maidan government, and he was present at a meeting in April 2014. Actually, around this time, as we're recording this in 2014, it was in mid-April 2014 when Ukraine launched its so-called anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass, so beginning the war in the Donbass. And when did that happen? It came right after John Brennan, then the head of the CIA, came to Ukraine, came to Kyiv, met with Ukrainian officials and said, you should launch an operation against the Donbass. He encouraged and basically told the new coup government to launch an operation against the Donbass. And that's exactly what the new government did. And Andrei Tillichenko was at that meeting and says that that's what John Brennan did. So, I mean, the U.S. role in this has been instrumental from the beginning. And it's just amazing that, 12 years now or 11 years after the Maidan coup, we're still learning critical details.
Yeah, well, even within the civilian government of Ukraine, you have people like Viktor Shokin, the former general prosecutor. He was fired by Biden, and Biden taking pride in it. But he also has given an interview where he argues that, yeah, that after the coup in 2014, that all new appointments had to be approved by Washington. He said they were running Ukraine like a fiefdom, and
Yeah.
and sometimes being even more bold. That is taking an actual American, like Natalia Yaresko, an actual American citizen from the U.S. State Department, now working in the think tanks, and putting her into the position as a Ukrainian finance minister. I mean, this. I just often ask, if the shoe was on the other foot, if this was the Russians doing something like this, what would we call it? But it's just very strange that the first impulse is always to excuse it and look the other way. But I guess with the fascists, this is something quite concerning. That yeah, now is suddenly we our first instinct when we see a swastika appearing on uniforms, fascist emblems, and yeah, the fascist slogans, putting up statues of Bandera, renaming streets. The first impulse always in our media is to make excuses. And well, you don't want to repeat Russian propaganda. It's kind of strange how we reached this point, though.
Yeah, and let me connect this New York Times article, this recent one, to current developments inside Ukraine. So, what just happened in Ukraine? Like, what's the big story this week? It's this Russian attack in Sumy, which reportedly killed at least 34 people, including at least two children, maybe more at this point. And this is a terrible attack, and nothing to me justifies Russia killing civilians. But what did we learn after that? Like, we learned that Ukraine had put on a military gathering in Sumy and basically in the heart of town, thereby giving Russians an excuse to attack, like a pretext. And we also learned that the attack killed a Ukrainian colonel who was a commander of a Ukrainian brigade that has HIMARS, U.S. HIMARS rocket launchers, right? And what's the importance of that? Well, in the New York Times article, the U.S. bragged that they vetted every single HIMARS strike by Ukraine against Russian forces, and that these HIMARS strikes caused Russian casualty rates to soar. So to me, Sumy, what happened at this tragedy in Sumy is an example of how the proxy wars put Ukrainians in danger. You have the New York Times bragging that the U.S. oversaw HIMARS strikes on Russian soldiers. And what does Russia now do? They go and kill the head of a brigade that has HIMARS. And I'm not saying that there's a connection between the Sumy strike and this New York Times article, but it just shows how by using Ukraine and by being involved in the war so directly, where the U.S. is overseeing HIMARS strikes, you're putting people in danger because Russia obviously had intelligence that this commander was there, and they targeted him because he was targeting Russian forces. In the process, a bunch of civilians got killed. And what also happened, by the way, the governor of Sumy, he's been fired because the allegation from the mayor of Sumy is that he put people in danger by having this military ceremony in Sumy that day, and therefore giving Russia a pretext to launch an attack. The one thing I don't get, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I don't know if you saw Lavrov. He said that in Sumy, Ukrainian military leaders were meeting with NATO counterparts, and so I don't understand what he was saying. Is he saying that Russia targeted not just Ukrainian military officials, but also NATO military officials as well? And that's the one part I didn't get, because if he really is saying that Russia targeted NATO officials, then that strikes me as very dangerous. And I haven't seen any confirmation yet that any NATO officials were killed.
Yeah, well, for just first on the Sumi strike, because what I found was interesting there is when I opened the newspapers, around Europe or watched the news channels, it's pretty much a full consensus that this had no military purpose. It was yeah, target on civilians, no legitimate targets nearby. But then you can open up the Ukrainian news, and they're openly discussing that yeah, the mayor was complaining that the military set up this award ceremony for people who had fought in I think it was in Kursk, and they had all these yeah, soldiers there, many leading officers, and then, well, why did you put this among our civilians? And now you attracted a Russian strike. So in Ukraine, they talk about this. There's divisions. They're angry with each other. They're throwing insults back and forth online. But then you come to the Western media, and I don't see it in this media. We seem to have reached this consensus that no, there was only civilians, and it's a very strange narrative. I think it's built around. The idea is if you recognize that there were military there, then assuming that it's yeah, which could then one argument can be made that it's a legitimate military target, then it can be conflated with somehow legitimizing it or even supporting the Russian strike. I mean, as you said, it's a horrible yeah, it was a horrible strike that had yeah, several civilian casualties, but reality should also be recognized. Now, regarding Lavrov, I picked up on this as well, and I thought it was strange that when he argued there were in NATO there, because now this sounds as a yeah, form of escalation. If you recognize, well, we knew that there were NATO soldiers there, so we targeted and killed them. So irrespective of it's being true or not, it is. It does signal that they're also prepared to step up the escalation ladder. Because with this new reports coming not just out of the New York Times and American media, but also British media, where they're now more or less bragging about how what a key role they had in killing thousands of Russians. Now, I think that this might be a response to this, where they can now also say, well, we're going to also now openly speak about killing NATO soldiers. So, but I agree, this is a very much like the NATO escalations. I think this is very dangerous escalations, and I think there's been a key issue in the Ukraine war the past 3 years is how do we define the rules of a proxy war? Because initially, if you remember, people like Biden saying, "Well, F-16s, that means World War III. You can't do this." We couldn't send artillery, tanks. All of this was very controversial, and now, we have from Germany merged talking about, yeah, we have to use German missiles to strike in deep into Russian territory. I mean,
Right.
this is just yeah, for Germany to do this again. I mean, they thought it was controversial to send helmets, and here we are.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. There's a line in the New York Times article where they quote some U.S. military official who says, our message to the Russians was very clear. This war will be fought only inside of Ukraine. That was but they that was not a clear message because they violated that pretty quickly when Ukraine inevitably started losing, which was just always inevitable. It was easily predictable, predicted by people like Barack Obama, who said when he was leaving office in 2016, he said, no matter what we do in Ukraine, Russia will always be able to overmatch it. So it's not controversial to have expected that Russia would win. And therefore, again, in the US, there's such a big talking point is that, we've always crossed Putin's red lines and he hasn't done anything. Now, I've actually never heard Putin set down red lines. So when people say Putin's red lines, I don't even know what they're talking about. And again, really, it's our own red lines that we've crossed. I mean, we set down, we weren't going to provide these long range weapon systems, and then we weren't going to let Ukraine use them inside Russia. We've crossed the red lines consistently because Ukraine has lost. And there's even a line in the New York Times article where it says that, finally Biden, his last months in office, let Ukraine use the ATACMS missiles inside Russia. And it says the wording is to shore up his Ukraine project. So what are they saying there? To keep his proxy war going, to save face because he knows he was losing. That Biden, in a final act of desperation, let Ukraine launch these long-range strikes into Russia. And you raise the question, what's next unless Trump gets off the train, which thankfully it looks like Trump wants to do, although there are advisors inside Trump's circle who don't want to stop the war. They want to continue it. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that Marco Rubio and others inside the administration, are skeptical of Steve Witkoff and his talks with Russian officials, and they think Witkoff is conceding too much. When I think Witkoff is just acknowledging reality that, as people have recognized for a long time, no matter what we do, Ukraine just can't win because Russia will always overmatch them because of its sheer size and proximity to Ukraine.
well, I guess also the problem is whenever Russia shows restraints, it's sold as weakness. So
Yeah.
again, the fact that they don't retaliate, it's always said as well. We can escalate further if they don't do anything. But I would point out that in 2014 they warned, don't topple the government in Ukraine. Did,
Yeah.
and they annexed Crimea in 2021. Russia said, you have to give us security guarantees, otherwise we'll have to do a military option and. They didn't get security guarantees, and again, they took military action. And in 2022, when the NATO began to send heavier and heavier weapons, they annexed four territories. And when we began to do direct missile strikes in 2024, the Russians changed the nuclear doctrine. So it's not as if they're not doing anything. I think it's just that whenever they do respond, then it's not weakness. Then it happens in a vacuum. It's unprovoked and aggressive. So there's no recognition of the security competition, I guess. But
Yes.
uh,
Now, I want to ask you one question. In the Times article, they say that at some point, U.S. officials estimated that there was a 50% chance, if I have this right, of Russia using nuclear weapons. And they based this on some chatter that they picked up from a top Russian general. Do you buy that? That really that there was such a high risk of Russia using nuclear weapons inside Ukraine? Because it doesn't make sense to me.
no, well, I think when was this though? Or
This was after some Russian setbacks.
uh,
So maybe after they lost Kherson in what was it, the fall 2022. But there's definitely a line in there that where they basically U.S. intelligence. Here, let me read it. Um, uh, they basically changed their assessment that of the probability of Russia using nuclear weapons. I'll just find the passage.
well, I think I'm a bit skeptical because when they pulled back, it was the main reason why they pulled back was because the whole war had changed its character. Because as we know, initially when the Russians invaded in 2022, as Zelensky confirmed on the first day after the invasion, was they had been already been contacted by Russia. They wanted to negotiate restoring Ukraine's neutrality. So everything from the troop levels to within the first days of the invasion, the Ukrainians confirmed that the Russians had contacted them. All of this, and also the amount of the lack of bombing of key targets, as the Russians were quite restrained in the first days because they didn't want to undermine the ability to pursue diplomacy, which has been confirmed also by American analysts. So
Yeah,
with all of this, it was quite clear that the Russians aimed to put in a lot of force. They didn't have enough troops to, conquer all of Ukraine, but the main point was to force the Ukrainians to to restore their neutrality, as they hadn't implemented the Minsk agreement in 7 years. The problem is when the US and UK sabotaged the Istanbul agreement, and then we effectively put a boycott on all diplomacy and negotiations with the Russians. It became a war of attrition. Now suddenly you have to fight till the end. So I think they reached this decision in 2022 that their supply lines were too stretched out. They were too thin. NATO was pouring in too many weapons. So what they had to do is prepare for a war of attrition, which means bleed out the enemy. So this made sense to pull out on the other side of the Dnieper River in Kherson to tighten up the front lines and then build proper fortification, not have these vulnerable supply chains, and then essentially, yeah, begin to kill, destroy the enemy. And I think meanwhile, while they're doing this, they built up a huge force in the rear with new weapons, new soldiers, and then they prepared until 2023, and then they went and started to move forward. So I think I don't think it was that desperate as we often
yeah,
portrayed us. But if the
yeah,
Russians were losing to a NATO army and they might take Crimea, I think the Russians do consider this to be an existential threat. And if it is existential, I do think they could. Well, I think honestly that there would be a nuclear war before NATO gets to march through Crimea. But I don't think they were at that point in 2022. I think it was. I think the extent to which this was a huge victory for Ukraine. I think it was more of a propaganda initiative in the West to build up support in among our public to support the war. That we can effectively bring Ukraine back to the 1991 borders.
yeah, yeah. And so it was from that period, from October 2022, after Russia withdrew from Kherson, and then the Times says that U.S. intelligence overheard Russia's Ukraine commander, General Sergei Surovikin, talking about using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent the Ukrainians from crossing the Dnipro and making a beeline to Crimea. Until that moment, U.S. intelligence agencies had estimated the chance of Russia's using nuclear weapons in Ukraine at 5 to 10%. Now they said if the Russian lines in the south collapsed, the probability was 50%. So that's what they're claiming. I
Well,
strongly doubt it, but but I also agree that, yeah, obviously Crimea is existential. And if there was a serious threat there, then we might have seen it. It's your assessment is that there was never that strong of a threat of losing Crimea at that point. And on the issue of Istanbul, I don't know if you saw this,
mm,
but there was a paper written by Alexander Chaly, who was a Ukrainian diplomat who was part of the Ukrainian negotiating team, and he's the one who famously said that line about how we managed to find a very real compromise in Istanbul, and he said Putin did everything possible to make peace, which again undermines the narrative that we've been fed for so long. And in fact, even acknowledging that the Istanbul talks existed, took place, is punctures the narrative itself, because at least in the U.S., corporate media here pretends as if those Istanbul talks didn't happen. They're almost never mentioned except for a couple of times. Like it took the New York Times until last year to publish a detailed article about it. Otherwise, totally ignored. But Charlie wrote a paper not long after the talks collapsed, I think about a year later. And he basically writes that uh, the U.S. The U.S. and UK told Ukraine at the time that basically don't make a deal with Russia based on security guarantees. And in fact, we're not going to participate. If you reach a deal with Russia with security guarantees, we're not going to participate. But if you walk away from the deal, we'll give you bilateral security guarantees. That was the message that Ukraine got from the US and UK. So what did Ukraine do? As we know, Zelensky walked away from Istanbul. So what happened afterwards? Zelensky goes back to the US and UK and says, hey, how about those security guarantees? And what does Charlie report? He says that at that point, the US and UK said, yeah, we're not prepared to give you security guarantees. We're prepared to give you future military assistance. So basically arming you to the teeth, but we're not actually prepared to guarantee your security. So that was a bait and switch. It was a false promise to Ukraine that will give you security guarantees if you walk away from these peace talks. And then when Ukraine came and asked the US and UK to make good on its offer, the US and UK said, forget it. It's just such a it's a betrayal. And this should be a top story, but it's not, because we can't even really acknowledge that the Istanbul talks took place and that they made serious progress, because that, of course, that undermines the narrative that we need to continue this proxy war for years to come, including now in 2025. Now we're talking about 3 years after the Istanbul talks collapsed. We're actually marking the anniversary right around now, because it was in April 2022 when Istanbul broke down.
well, in March of 2022, Zelensky gave an interview with The Economist, and he said, there's some countries in the West who wouldn't mind a long war because they get to bleed out the Russians, but even though this means the destruction of Ukraine. So apparently Zelensky is also a Russian propagandist, but we don't want this narrative anymore in media. Anyways,
Yeah,
yeah, we a bit over time here, so I just want to say one thing about the Russians using nuclear weapons. It's worth noting that General Milley in November of 2022, he argued that this is as good as it gets for the Ukrainians. This is why it's a good idea for Ukraine to make a deal now, because from here it's only downhill. Now this is, well, it's interesting because he was forced to walk this back, because being pro-Ukrainian means to continue throwing Ukrainians into war. But in terms of your question, I think this is, it was obvious for the Americans that this was not this great potential to push the Russians all the way into Crimea yet. So given that the Americans understood this, I think the Russians also understood it. So I think the idea that they were about to reach for the nuclear weapons, that this is, more propaganda. Anyways, Aaron Maté, thank you so much. And you're coming to Oslo on the 21st of May to
that's
speak
right.
at a conference here. So this will also be broadcast, and I'll probably share it on this channel as well. So
Great.
thank you so much
Great.
for your time.
Thank you, Glenn. Great to join you.